Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. Welcome to the fourth webinar of the Muslims in Britain Research Group at Liverpool Hope University. I am Salman Al-Azami, the convener of this research group. This research group draws on cross-disciplinary research, working collaboratively on various issues related to the challenges faced by British Muslims in 21st century Britain. The main aim of this group is to develop and share new ideas of research in this field, increase interdisciplinary research, identify areas of collaborative research, organize research seminars and conferences, and develop partnerships with major Muslim community organizations. Although we are based in Liverpool Hope University, our research group includes academics and postgraduate students in various disciplines and across different universities. Currently, our membership also includes colleagues from Liverpool, Liverpool John Moores, Manchester, and Cardiff universities. In the globalized world we live in today, where there is a high demand for information sharing that goes beyond the remit of one institution in a nation state, we have decided to make all our events online so that we can reach people around the world who would be interested to listen to our talks and events. We intend to organize research webinars, roundtables, and interviews online and later upload them on our YouTube channel for people to access in their own time. We would appreciate moral support and constructive advice from our live and YouTube audiences. Please use the Q&A option here to post comments and ask questions. I will go through them after the talk and our guest will answer as many questions as possible. Please note that the Q&A section will not be uploaded on YouTube. Let us now focus on our talk today. The title of today's webinar is Extremist, Devout, Moderate, Changing Representations of Muslims and Beliefs in the UK Press. An aspect of today's talk features as a chapter in my recently published edited book, Media Language on Islam and Muslims, Terminologies and Their Effects. Our guest speaker is Paul Baker, who is a professor of English language at Lancaster University. He has written 22 books on various topics related to language, identity, media, social history, including the book Discourse Analysis and Media Attitudes, The Representation of Islam in the British Press, with Kostas Gabrielatos and Tony McNary. Tony is also one of the contributors of my book. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He's also the commissioning editor of the journal Corpora. Paul is at the moment in Hong Kong, and we are grateful that he agreed to give us this time despite his busy schedule. Without further ado, I'd now like to invite our guest speaker to begin his presentation. Yes, Paul.
Thank you very much, Salman. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yes, I can.
Great, okay. So in this talk, I'm going to examine the extent to which the British press in recent years have associated Muslims and Islam with the concepts of terrorism and extremism. So I'll be carrying out what's called a corpus-assisted discourse analysis of almost 1 million British newspaper articles which refer to Muslims and Islam, and these were published between the years 1998 and 2019. Now, terrorism is a topic which ticks a very large number of what Galtung and Rouge refer to as news values. And I've put a list of some of those news values just there on that screen for you to look at. So a news value is essentially a list of various pressures on news reporters which influence the kinds of stories that get published in newspapers. So, for example, a story will get more attention if it has the news value of negativity. Bad news travels faster than good news, as we all know. Stories that occur suddenly, as opposed to long-term events that also tend to make news, and those involving conflict, unexpectedness, and ambiguity will also get reported. So, although terrorist events are relatively rare, particularly in the UK, and they don't usually impact directly on very many people when they do occur, they do key into a lot of news values. And terrorism is also particularly newsworthy because it's very high in terms of two kinds of risk, risk which is cognitive and risk which is emotional. Now, according to Slovic, risks can occur in terms of whether they're a known risk, which relates to cognition, or our understanding of event, or whether they relate to dread, which is to do with emotion. So a known risk is something which is kind of understood by scientists. It would be something like, say, the effects of alcohol or the dangers of cars. And this diagram kind of shows different kinds of risks and where they kind of relate in terms of whether they're known or unknown, or whether they're a dread risk or not a dread risk. So you can see that cars, auto accidents, for example, are kind of towards the bottom of this figure because we know about them, or scientists do. And unknown risks would be things like nitrates, DNA technology, or microwave ovens. I should point out this was done in 1987, so things may be more known now than they used to be in this table. Now, a dread risk is more emotional. So this refers to our perceptions of risk and the kind of emotions that they evoke in us. So a dread risk is something which is particularly horrible, involving lack of control or fatal consequences. So you can see the risks on the left-hand side of this figure don't hold very much dread for people, things like caffeine or trampolines or water chlorination. But on the right side of the diagram, we have things like nuclear weapons, nerve gas accidents, and radioactive waste, which kind of hold more dread for people. Now, terror, I would argue, is both high in terms of being unknown and dreadful. It's something that occurs unexpectedly, we have no preparation for it, and it's a very horrible event which threatens your life. Now, Slovak didn't include it in the diagram, but I'm suggesting it should be placed somewhere in that top right-hand section. Now, thankfully, most of us will not experience terrorism firsthand. The ways that we find out about it are through the news, and news venues play an important role in terms of framing how societies understand terrorism and the kinds of people who might be associated with it. So I just put on this slide a few examples from the British press, which kind of illustrate potentially why I got interested in this in the first place. And it shows some of the ways that journalists associate Islam with terror and extremism. So terms like Islamic firebrand, Muslim terror, and militant Islam paint a very negative picture of Islam. And these are effectively examples of what is sometimes called in corpus linguistics discourse prosody. Now, discourse prosody involves patterns between a word or a phrase and another set of related words that suggest a particular stance or attitude or representation or evaluation in some way. So in this case here, we're seeing a repeated association of one set of words, words like Islamic, Muslim, and Islam, with another set, which are things like terror, firebrand, and militant. Now, for regular readers of certain newspapers, these kinds of associations build up day after day to the extent that the concepts can become intertwined. So the mention of one concept, such as Muslims, could trigger the thought of another, such as terror, or vice versa. Now, for decades, the Western news media have made an association between Islam and extremism, but they're usually rather vague about what extremism actually entails. Now, official definitions can provide some clues, but unfortunately, the definitions keep changing over time. And these are just 3 examples I've got from the UK. The first one's from 2011, where the British government defined extremism as vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. Although we've got a more detailed definition in 2016. Now, this was relating to a libel case referred to as Begg versus the BBC, and the Honourable Justice Haddon Cave gave a 10-point guide to what constitutes extremist Islamic positions. And among these, I haven't listed them all here, but he says things like they count as an us versus them view of the world, reduction of jihad to armed combat, ignoring or flouting conditions for armed combat, and viewing armed combat as a universal individual religious obligation. And then more recently in 2024, the government provided a new definition of extremism, which it said was the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance. So you can see how the original definition then, which is about opposition to British values, has changed, and the new version is now more about promoting an ideology. Now, the terminology there was quite vague, and particularly if we consider what it means by an ideology based on hatred or intolerance. So, for example, what about intolerance of practices which contribute towards global warming, Or what about hatred of people who are violent themselves? And note how that last definition uses the word ideology. So then the question is, could a religion be seen also as an ideology? So Anglo-centric media has tended to represent Islam as an extreme religion. And so this slide here shows a few relevant studies. Going back to 1996, we've got Awas, who found that American media depicts Islam as a threat to Western security associated with fundamentalism and terrorism. Dunn looked at 2 Australian newspapers in 2001 and concluded that Muslims were constructed as fanatic, intolerant, fundamentalist, misogynistic, and alien 75% of the time they were mentioned. And positive constructions only accounted for 25% of cases. A study by Poole in 2002 found that British Muslims were represented as irrational and antiquated, a threat to democracy, involved in crime, they were extremist, and they were influenced by Muslims overseas. And then we have John Richardson's 2004 study of British news broadsheets, and he identified 4 main themes around Islam as a military threat associated with terrorism, extremism, a threat to democracy, and a sexist or a social threat. And he said that journalists tend to engage in 3 processes when they report on British Muslims. The first of these is separation, so the idea that Muslims are kind of apart from the British people. Then there's differentiation, the idea that they're different from British people, and then finally negativization, that they're bad. Now, those studies used a range of methods, from qualitative analyses of articles to a kind of content analysis based upon quantifying patterns or counting themes. I'm going to talk about an earlier study which Salman mentioned at the beginning, which I carried out with Tony McHenry and Kostas Gabrielatos in 2013. And this took a different approach, a sort of a larger scale approach, where we used corpus linguistics techniques. So this involves basically using computer software to help us to identify patterns of language in very large data sets called corpora. And then they kind of give us the way in. The computer programs give us the way into the data sets, telling us what's frequent or salient or kind of unusual. And then we have to kind of go into those data sets and read the texts ourselves to try to make sense of what those kind of words and phrases that are very frequent or salient are being used to achieve in the articles. And we collected British news articles between 1998 and 2009, which contained at least 1 mention of a set of words relating to Islam. And I'll show you that set of words in a little bit. So what did we find? Well, we found that references to terror were actually more common than references to the words relating to Islam that we used to build our data set, which is very unexpected. We didn't expect words relating to terror to be actually more frequent than the words we used to build the corpus. And if you were just looking at the corpus, you'd think it was a corpus about terror rather than a corpus about Islam, because those terror words were so frequent. The most common theme in the article is related to conflict in some ways. Muslims were regularly represented negatively as holding extreme beliefs, being very quick to take offense, and as forming part of a separate community from the rest of the UK. Now, some newspapers, particularly the tabloids, published extremely negative representations of Muslims. They devoted a small amount of attention to a small number of hate preachers. They demonized Muslims who received government assistance. And when it came to talking about Muslim women who wore the veil, they either represented them as quite difficult and demanding or as passive victims. And over the period we examined, we found that the representations that had initially been quite popular in the conservative tabloid newspapers were kind of creeping into other kinds of newspapers, suggesting that the kind of tabloid representations were becoming more popular and were maybe quite influential across the whole of the British press. Now, I should bear in mind that that study only looked at articles up to 2009, which was quite a long time ago by now. And since then, there have been quite concerted efforts to address how newspapers write about Muslims and Islam. So organisations like the British Muslim Council, the Muslim British Council, and associated groups like the Centre for Media Monitoring and MEND, which is Muslim Engagement and Development, have helped to foster increasing awareness, and to an extent, journalists have shown some willingness to listen and change. I remember a cross-parliamentary event organised by the Centre for Media Monitoring I went to in 2019. I remember I spoke at the event, and sitting right next to me were editors of 2 tabloid newspapers who also spoke at the event as well. And I thought that was pretty great at the time, something which would have been unthinkable in 2001. And it shows the kind of willingness of editors to kind of engage with the kind of concerns of Muslims. So in the study I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to revisit some of the main findings from that 2013 study. I want to focus on the ways that Muslims and Islam are linked to concepts around terrorism and extremism or other forms of belief. And I'm going to be using a much larger data set. I'm going to expand the study I initially did to not just consider national newspapers, but local ones as well, and some online ones. And my analysis focuses on the extent to which the patterns around extremism that I found in the earlier study have changed for better or worse in this later, more kind of aware period of 2010 to 2019. So I'll try to quickly describe how I built the new data set and how I analyzed it. Building a data set was probably easier than you'd expect, considering how many articles we had to collect. It was not done by me at this time. It was done by a colleague at Lancaster called Isabel Clark, and she used an online news archive called Nexus, and she kindly let me use her data for this study. With Nexus, it's a kind of database online, and you have to be specific and type in a set of words or phrases, and then Nexus returns all of the articles that have any mentions of those words or phrases, and you can download them yourself to analyze. For the 2013 study, we'd created a kind of list of words that we used to collect articles then, which I've shown here. And we used the same phrase, the same kind of search term for this more recent study to be consistent, really. Now, that exclamation mark, which you can see on quite a lot of the search terms there, acts as a wild card. So it stands for any set of characters. So if you can see the term Muslim exclamation mark, that will return articles that contain the word Muslim or the word Muslims, for example. You can see that towards the end of the search term, we used a few excluding terms. So we wanted to get the word sunny, but we didn't want to get the word sunnily. So we have at the end saying not sunnily. Now, this search term was reasonably good at giving us relevant articles. It did, though, give us a few false positives, which are articles that we actually didn't want to collect, but shouldn't have been in there. And sometimes that's one of the ways of doing research. You don't find things out quite a bit later on. So as we were doing our research, we found there were a few articles relating to business and economics, and they didn't seem to be about Muslims at all. And we couldn't work out why on earth they'd been returned by Nexus. Then we noticed that they were written by a journalist called Faisal Islam, who writes a business column. So Islam can be a name of somebody as well as the name of their religion. And Faisal Islam, any article that he'd written ended up getting into our data set. And that explains why we had all of these business articles appearing. It's unfortunate, but overall, we had a very, very large number of articles. We had 815 million words. So having a few business articles by one journalist in there wasn't really going to change things one way or the other. So that was kind of okay. Now, to analyze the data, we mounted it on a specialist corpus tool called CQPweb. This is a screenshot of what that tool looks like. And this was created by another Lancaster person, Andrew Hardy. And this tool lets you do searches on your corpus or your data. It will count frequencies of words for you. It will show up notable patterns of words and relationships between words that are very unexpected. And it also shows you the words in context as well, so you can read them and get a sense of what's happening with them. So this screenshot shows what's called a concordance table of the term Muslim terrorist or Muslim terrorists. And you can see this is just sort of 19 examples of this phrase. There were actually 1,456 cases, so I'd have to scroll down quite a lot to read them all if I wanted to. So this table at the top shows how I've divided our corpus into 3 time periods. It's a 20-year period altogether. I've got a first period, which is 10 years, which kind of matches the initial study that I did. So that's 1998 to 2009. And then I've got 2 further periods, each of 5 years, one which is 2010 to 2014, and then 2015 to 2019. So you can see altogether that comes to 815 million words of data. And it's about 1 million articles. You can see that the amount of data in each of those 3 time periods is not the same. It doesn't, there's more in the latter period. So when we start comparing these 3 time periods against each other, if we're looking at frequencies of words, obviously if we look at the last period, because there's more data there, the frequencies are probably going to be quite a bit higher, and that won't tell us very much. So when we look at frequencies, we have to standardize the frequencies, looking at occurrences per million words of data in each data set. And looking at relative frequencies across the 3 sets lets us make better comparisons between them. So I'm going to focus on patterns around 4 words. I'm going to look at Muslim, which I've combined with the plural form Muslims. Then I've got Islamic, Islam, and Islamist. So my question is, how often do these words occur with words that relate to strength of belief, like extremism, or words relating to terrorism? Is there change over time? And also, what does qualitative analysis of these belief and terror words reveal about press representation? Because I think it's important not just to look at the frequencies, but then to actually go into the data and read lots of examples to see what is actually happening on the ground when people use these words in newspaper articles. So what kind of words am I looking at? Well, based upon my earlier study, I've identified some sets of words which commonly refer to different types of belief. So I've got 3 types. I've got a set of extremist words, which are words like militant, radical, fundamentalist, separatist, hardliner, etc. Then I've got a kind of set of words which refer to having a kind of devout religious belief. So these are words like committed or strict or orthodox or faithful, pious, observant. And then finally, I've got a set of words which refer to maybe a more kind of liberal perspective, words like secular or moderate or progressive. And added to that, I've got a 4th category which relates to terrorist words. And my question would be, if I found all the instances of the words in our news articles, counted them all up, and added the words in each category, which of these 4 categories would be the most frequent? A second question would be, if we looked at the 3 time periods for the 4 categories, which categories would get more frequent over time, which categories would get less frequent over time? So that's my initial questions, and let's find out the answers to them. So this is my first chart, and here we're just looking at the words relating to terror. So these are words like terror, terrorism, terrorist, terrorists. And the chart shows the combined frequencies of those terror words for the 3 time periods. And I've drawn this as a line, so it's kind of easier for you to see the direction of change over time. But the line really only has 3 points on it. And the frequencies, just to remind you, are based upon relative frequencies or occurrences per million words, so you can make better comparisons between the time periods. So what can we see here? Well, we've got a kind of small dip during the period 2010 to 2014 compared to before. And then there's quite a big leap in the 3rd period, 2015 to 2019. So let's leave that line there and then add in another line which relates to the words about extremism. Try to imagine where you think that next line is going to appear. Will it be above the terror line, or will it be below the terror line? Okay, here it is. So this kind of reddy-orangey line is for the extremist words, like fundamentalist and hardliner and militant and radical. And you can see there's actually not a great deal of change here over time. The extremist words are generally less frequent than the terror words. They're still pretty frequent, though. In the middle time period, 2010 to 14, they're actually about the same frequency as the terror words. And you can see that the 2 lines kind of meet there in the middle. Okay, so next I'm going to add a line telling you about the words that relate to the devout kind of belief, strength of belief. So these are words like devout and strict and committed. So again, try to imagine where you think that line is going to appear. Will it be above the blue line, or will it be below all the other lines? And here it is. So you can see that references to devoutness are not that common relative to extreme and terror words. So this is quite a straight line here as well. So it's a kind of concept that's not that common, but it's kind of stayed fairly stable over time. And finally, I'll add another line, which is to do with the liberal words like moderate and secular. And so here this one is. And it's pretty similar, actually, to the devout line. It's almost a straight line as well. Again, there's a slight decline there over time, but you can barely see it. The line looks almost straight. So the main takeaway from this table then is, sorry, the chart is that big rise in words relating to terrorism in articles about Muslims and Islam. And this is particularly in the last 5 years that we looked at. So how would we explain this kind of big slope of the blue line towards the end of the graph? Well, one thing I thought about was maybe we could link it to the frequency of reporting of real world news events. Is there just more terrorism going on in 2015 to 2019 in the UK, for example, or around the world? For example, in 2013, there was the rise of Islamic State, and the number of global terror attacks and deaths leading from that point peaked in 2014, but remained relatively high for the remainder of that decade at around 4,000 attacks per year. In the UK, though, there actually weren't that many terror attacks between 2010 and 2019, just 14 in total. 10 of those attacks involved perpetrators who were motivated by a violent interpretation of jihadism, and 6 of those attacks resulted in deaths, where across them 40 people were killed. I'll point out also that 3 terror attacks in that period involved people trying to kill Muslims. Now, this table shows which countries and groups are most likely to appear near the word terror, either 3 words either side of it to the left or the right, within the whole of my newspaper. Sorry, just for the last time period, the last 5 years. And I've only included countries or groups which occur more than 1,000 times. You can see that references to ISIS and Islamic State are quite high there, but the majority of the words in this table relate to contexts that involve Europe or the UK. Paris is actually the top word when the word terror occurs near it. And that relates to a series of attacks that took place in 2015, and then there were some more attacks that took place in 2017 in Paris. Towards the bottom of the table, you might notice the words Syria and Turkey, but then there were lots of other countries where terrorist attacks occurred during this period, places like Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indonesia, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. And they were talked about much less often in the news in relation to terror attacks, even though they actually experienced terror attacks quite a lot. So the main focus of the newspapers here is about the attacks in the UK, where there weren't actually that many terror attacks, and also Western Europe. Now, moving on to maybe a slightly more qualitative analysis at this point, I started thinking about the terms, how they were used in context, and also whether newspapers tried to distinguish between them or kind of explain or define what these terms meant. And they rarely did so. They rarely explained what they meant by them. So they kind of used them in ways where they expected you to understand them as well. Sometimes the boundaries between these kind of groups of words, of belief systems, kind of appeared to be quite fluid. So look at that first example I've put there. Algeria is also home to extreme militant terrorist groups. So we've got a kind of running together of extreme militant and terrorists, almost as if they're the same thing. In the second example, we've got an Islamic extremist terrorist again. So extremism and terrorism are kind of linked together, meaning kind of the same thing. But we've also got cases like the last one, where the concepts of terrorism, extremism are applied to be related to each other, but also kind of different or separate in some way. So we've got references to extremist and terrorist groups. So there were 2 different types of groups here, although they all talked about in the same breath. On the other hand, though, there's maybe a clearer division between devout terms and extremist terms. So in the first example here, there's a reference to someone who was a student, and his parents say he was devout, but not militant. We'll see later on, though, that isn't always the case of making that distinction. Sometimes devout is used in quite kind of subtle ways to imply militancy. Also, there's this distinction between devout and moderate belief, but it appears in some articles but not others. So look at that second example there. Someone's described as is a devout but moderate Muslim. So this is a kind of case of exception negating. It implies that typically devout Muslims are not moderate. Now, that chart I put up a bit earlier on, it only shows the frequencies of the words in the corpus that relate to belief. Now, there may be other cases where some of those words actually don't relate to belief. They're not used as we expect them to. So, for example, one of the words I looked at was the word strict. Now, strict can often be used in this corpus to relate to Muslims' belief, but it could also be used in a case like, say, a nightclub having a strict door policy. So these words don't necessarily always relate to Muslims when they're used in the corpus, although the majority of the time they do. So to have maybe a more kind of clear analysis, we need to use the concept of collocation to better understand representations around Islam and Muslims in the corpus. So collocation refers to the co-occurrence of words, and I want to use it to identify the proportion of times that Muslim, Islam, Islamic, and Islamist co-occur with between 1 to 3 words of these words which relate to different kinds of belief. So I'll show you another chart here, and hopefully that will be a bit clearer of what I mean. So this chart asks, if we see a word like Muslim in the corpus, what percentages of cases of that word Muslim will appear next to or near the word terror, terrorism, terrorist, or terrorists? And when I say near, I mean between 1 to 3 words in the immediate vicinity, either left or right, of the word Muslim. And I've done this for Muslim, Islam, Islamic, and Islamist. And so we've got the percentage occurrences for the 3 time periods as well. The blue bars here relate to 1998 to 2009. The orangey red ones relate to 2010 to 2014. And the grey ones relate to 2015 to 2019. So we can see that the bars are biggest with the word Islamist. And that tells us that Islamist tends to be the word that co-occurs most when terror words with nearby. And this is most common for that grey bar, which relates to that last time period, 2015 to 2019. So in that period, 2015 onwards, if you read the word Islamist in the British press, you'd see a word relating to terror nearby 16.3% of the time, which is about 1 in 6 cases of the word Islamist have a terror word nearby, which is quite a lot of cases. Now, this chart indicates that, relatively speaking, Muslims and Islam actually aren't directly associated with terror very often. They occur less than 1% of the time, those words with terror. But the terror words are much more strongly associated with Islamic and Islamist. Now, if you look at those orange bars in the middle, they're all smaller. So the orange bars are smaller than the blue ones and the grey ones either side of them, which kind of implies that there was a decline in that middle period, 2010 to 2014, of associating these words with terror. But then the grey bars are bigger, particularly for Islamist, and it seems that that practice of using terror increases in that last period. Now, the strong association of Islamist and terror words could be seen as having a kind of priming effect, where even when Islamist occurs away from terror words, the association could be triggered off because of all the previous encounters that people may have had when they've read newspapers where Islamist has appeared with terror. And Shepard et al. In 2009 have noticed that the term Islamist has kind of acquired a quasi-criminal connotation. It's associated with people who want to establish through violent means an Islamic state or impose Sharia law. Now, not all of the cases in figure 1 that I just showed you there before are straightforwardly used in a negative way. I found a very small number of cases which mentioned that sometimes people use a term like Muslim terrorist and they use it in quite a racist way. So in that first example there at the top, a British Sikh has described how he was attacked in a Polish nightclub and called a Muslim terrorist. In other sections of the press, though, there's criticism of people who say that we should not use terms like Muslim terrorist. So that second article is a leader article in the Express. It's kind of complaining about the culture of the BBC. It's quite sarcastic about the BBC. It says that staff are discouraged from using Muslim terrorist and they should instead use a word like militant or Islamist. It's also worth pointing out that some cases of terms involving Muslim and terror together are from members of the public when they've written in letters to newspapers, and then the newspapers have published the letters. So look at that last example from the Daily Star, which uses a very generalizing term, Muslim terror. And printing newspaper letters, readers' letters in newspapers is one way that newspapers can avoid criticism for the maybe more negative uses of language. Now here's another chart. This is the same information as before, but this time we're looking at the extremist words and how they associate with Muslim, Islam, Islamic, and Islamist over time, as opposed to the terrorist words. So these are words like hardline, militant, radical, extremist. I've used the same scale for the y-axis as for the previous chart there, and you can see here that the bars are a bit bigger than that previous chart for terror, suggesting that there's more association of these words with extremism than with terrorism. Again, though, as before, we're seeing more links of extremism with Islamic and Islamist, as opposed to Muslim and Islam. And in 2015 to 2019, Islamist, that's the grey bar right at the end, the big one, that appeared with an extremist word around 1 in every 4 times that it was mentioned. And that suggests a very, very strong priming effect. Although if you look at the beginning of that chart with the word Muslim, you can see that extremist words and Muslim are going down over time because the grey bar is smaller than the orange bar, and the orange bar is smaller than the blue bar. Now, maybe a term like Islamic extremism isn't as bad as a term like Muslim extremist, because Islamic extremism doesn't seem to be directly labeling a person, whereas Muslim extremist does label a person, so it seems more kind of targeted at an individual. However, the Muslim Council of Britain has requested that journalists don't use the phrase Islamic extremism. They don't view it as a neutral term, and they say it makes a direct link between the religion and the ideology of extremism. And they say Islam is a general term for a religion which is practiced by 1.8 billion people all over the world. There are several schools of jurisprudence within Islam and numerous interpretations of key texts. So if we use a term like Islamic extremism, we're kind of massively overgeneralizing what's happening, implying that there's something essentially extreme about Islam, which is not the case. So a question would be, in that case, maybe we should say a term like Muslim extremist is better. But again, the Muslim Council of Britain say that this term is also quite problematic. It's not demonizing the entire religion of Islam, but it's laying the blame at the door of an individual and implying that the religion of the individual is relevant here. Now, one question at this point that I wondered about is what else might get referred to as an extremist in this corpus? Is it always Islam, or do other groups or kinds of people get referred to as extremists? I did find a smaller number of mentions of far right and right-wing extremists in the corpus. Now, that refers to a political stance rather than a religion, and Islam is a religion, so it's not exactly the same thing. I did then look for references to other religions or religious people described as extremists who weren't Muslims. I found a very, very small number of mentions of Christian extremists in the corpus. Though the issue here is that this is a corpus about Islam, so we maybe wouldn't expect to find references to Christianity that often in it anyway. So it's not really a fair comparison. So what I thought I'd do is I'd do a new search. I went back to the database of Nexus and I looked for the equivalent time period, 1998 to 2019, and I looked for references of Christian extremists occurring in the corpus and compared that to the frequency of Muslim extremists occurring in Nexus. So in Nexus in that time period, Muslim extremist occurs 1,450 times. The equivalent figure across all of Nexus for Christian extremist is 78. So Muslim extremists are mentioned 18 times more often than Christian extremists across British news as a whole. It's also quite interesting to look at those 78 cases where Christian extremists are mentioned in the news and to see what's actually happening. And actually, in some cases, newspapers actually say, it's actually a really, really rare term. So this is an article from the Telegraph, and it's saying, we talk about Islamic extremism and Islamic terrorism, but we don't talk about Christian extremism or Catholic terrorists. So that's a kind of maybe a rare case of a newspaper kind of questioning the uses of these terms and why we use them so often in relation to Islam, but not other religions. Now, moving on, as well as looking at who gets described as an extremist, we can actually ask how are they represented in terms of what they're described as doing or having done to them. So this table is again a kind of collocational table, and it's showing the top verbs which collocate or co-occur, 3 words either side, of all the extremist words collectively for each of the 3 time periods. One point to note here, which you probably can see if you compare the 3 columns of words for the 3 time periods, is that there's quite a lot of similarity, particularly at the top of the columns. So in all 3 periods, the top 3 verbs are said, then killed, then claimed. So that's saying extremists said something, or extremists killed somebody, or extremists were killed, or extremists claimed something. What I would note is maybe an interesting difference here is that there are more verbs relating to violence in the later 2 sections of the corpus. So there's only 2 violence verbs in the top 10 in that first time period, 1998 to 2009. We've got killed, and then we've got attacked. And these are raw frequencies, I should mention, by the way, not standardized frequencies. But there are 6 violence verbs in 2010 to 2014, and there are 5 violence verbs in 2015 to 2019. And so what this suggests is that over time, extremists seem to be increasingly represented as involved in acts of violence, as opposed to saying things that might make them appear to be extremist. So what it seems to be the case is that extremists are increasingly seen to be doing things that we probably associate with terrorism, such as killing people and attacking them, being violent towards them, as opposed to kind of saying things or believing things that make them extremist. We'll now look at the patterns of collocation for the devout words. So these are words like orthodox, pious, committed, devout, strict, faithful, and observant. And again, how do these words occur with the 4 words relating to Islam, and how does that change over time? And you can see that these are little blips, and the bars are so small you can barely see them on this table and this chart, sorry, compared to the terror and extreme words we looked at before. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the y-axis so we can more easily compare the 4 words and the time periods again across each other. So at the moment, the y-axis goes up to 30. I'm going to change it to just 1.4%. So it's the same chart. I've just changed the y-axis to make the lines a bit bigger so you can see the differences more easily here. Now, what we're seeing here is the reverse of what we saw for the terror and extremist words. We're seeing Muslim is more likely to be associated with devout belief now, and Islamist is least likely, which is the opposite of what we saw before. But generally what we're seeing is that devout Muslims are getting less frequent over time, as the grey bar now is smaller for Muslim and the blue bar is highest for Muslim. Now, some cases of devout Muslim are used in fairly kind of innocent context where Muslim is maybe being described as a victim of crime. So look at that first example. This is a doctor who's a Muslim who is described by a chief inspector as a devout Muslim and a family man. And it looks as if he's been involved in a kind of racially motivated attack on him. So both these terms, devout Muslim and family man, are kind of used together to kind of give this guy a sense of how positive he is. It's kind of a positive representation of him. And it helps to kind of give a sense of kind of outrage and sympathy towards this attack which has happened. So that's one article. And while terms like devout Muslim are generally represented more positively in the news compared to terms like Muslim extremist, there are some kind of slightly kind of suspicious ways maybe in which maybe the devout words are used in ways which actually appear to be a bit more like extremist than you'd maybe expect. So look at that second example. Boko Haram's goal is to turn Nigeria into a devout Muslim state under Sharia law. It bombs churches, schools, and slaughters men, women, and children. So even though this is supposed to be devout, when you look at what it's doing things which you'd associate with terrorism, like bombing and killing people. The third example uses an interesting phrase, devout, described as a devout Muslim. So this is someone described as a devout Muslim, and then you read on from it. It's someone who tried to ignite an explosive device on the plane after shouting about Afghanistan on Christmas Day and had bomb materials sewn into his underwear. So this is a kind of an example of somebody who is maybe seen as maybe a hypocrite. They're claiming to be devout Muslim, but actually they're a terrorist or an extremist. And this phrase described as a devout Muslim is quite common across the whole corpus. I looked at cases of described or cast or projected or regarded or portrayed as a devout Muslim, and there were 155 cases. And every time it occurred, it was in this kind of context, where somebody is described as a devout Muslim, and then, hey, guess what? They're not. They're doing something of a terrorist nature. So the implication is people, when they're claiming to be devout, actually aren't. They're kind of people who are dangerous and must be suspected of something. And look at the fourth example. We've got a much more clear picture here. A rapist who masqueraded as a devout Muslim was blasted as a hypocrite by a judge as he was jailed for 16 years for attacks on schoolgirls. So these words like devout and strict and committed and pious might appear to be fairly innocent on the surface, but when we look at how they're used in the press, a different picture emerges. Devout is often associated with being extremist or criminal. Muslims are painted as being hypocrites or liars. And so the effect of all these stories cumulatively is to raise questions about what a devout Muslim actually is. Okay, so this is the last chart I have, and this relates to the relationship between words that describe a liberal identity, like progressive and secular and moderate, and how often they occur with words relating to Islam and Muslims. Now, again, these are relatively rare words, and if you look at the y-axis, it only goes up to 1.8% again. So I've already adjusted the y-axis for you. Most of the cases don't actually go above 1% of the time. So very rarely we see Muslims being described as moderate or progressive or liberal or secular, things like that. And it seems to be a pattern that's generally decreasing over time. All of the grey bars there are lower than their respective blue bars for the four words. Now, unlike the devout words, the moderate ones are at least used in a more straightforwardly positive way when they're describing Muslims. So look at the first example here. We've got somebody called Sir Andrew, and he says, we need to find ways of strengthening the hand of moderate Muslim leaders. And so these are Muslims described with young Muslims with future leadership potential. So we're not kind of seeing these kind of insinuations that moderate Muslims are secretly extremists. But take a look at the second example, and we see maybe a bit of a less positive case. So this is from the Express, and we've got moderate Muslim leaders and parents should be more aware that their confused and disillusioned youth are prime targets for the extremists and preachers of hate. So there's a sense here that moderate Muslims, although they're kind of good in themselves, they're not doing enough to be kind of focusing on potential threats within other parts, maybe of their sort of social networks or communities. At other times, the term itself has been criticized in the press with saying that there's kind of implications associated with it. So in the third example at the bottom, The Independent, the writer here says that the term moderate Muslim is a sad reflection of how Islamophobia is subtly working its way into our national mentality. It says that the term suggests that Muslims who practice their faith in some limited capacity can be upstanding members of society, but those who practice it more fully are a danger to us all. So while the press generally view moderate Muslims as good Muslims, there's then the implication that Muslims who are not seen as moderate are problematic. And even if you're seen as devout, that can carry connotations of extremism. So that kind of there's a very thin line, I think, between crossing over from being a good moderate Muslim to being something else. And even the good moderate Muslims are seen as maybe not doing enough to kind of counter extremism elsewhere. So what can we conclude from all of this analysis? Well, it's a bit of a mixed pattern. I think, first of all, the key pattern is that there's been a gradual avoidance of labeling people in terms of their strength of belief. So less references to Muslims, the people, as being extremist or devout or liberal over time. Instead, what we're seeing, though, are labels of strength of belief that are being attributed more to abstract concepts, words like Islam, for example. which is more likely to be associated with extremist belief over time. We also see that terms like extremist are increasingly associated with acts of war or terror in the later half of the corpus, and that suggests that the meaning of extremist has shifted in the news to become more similar to that of terrorist. Now, there are kind of implications there, because if the meanings of those two terms become conflated together and sort of almost interchangeable, then extremist becomes quite a dangerous label to use on someone. It implies that you're likely to be violent, rather than just holding beliefs that might be seen as extreme. We've also seen how discussion of terrorism has increased over time, while discussion of devout or liberal types of belief or moderate beliefs are less common, and they've tended to be less associated with Muslims or Islam over time as well. So there are indications that journalists have moved away from labeling Muslims as extremist, but they've shifted more towards labeling Islam, the religion, as extremist. And it reminds me a bit of that old phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin. Maybe cynically, that could be viewed as a strategy to maintain a negative position around Islam while avoiding criticism, because you're not picking on individuals. What would be the potential impact of these repetitive associations on regular readers of the British press? Well, I'll refer you to a couple of recent surveys. There's one here towards the bottom of the page I've mentioned, and this was in 2024 by YouGov. They found that half of the public in Great Britain believed that the biggest extremist threat was from Islamic extremists. And 76% of people considered Islamic extremists to be a big or moderate threat, although attitudes did differ among political lines. I mentioned another study, and this is in 2022 by the University of Birmingham, but it was in connection with YouGov again. They found that 25.9% of the British public felt negatively towards Muslims. 9.9% of those people were very negative towards Muslims, and only gypsies and travellers were viewed more negatively than Muslims as a social group in the UK. 18.1% of the public wanted to ban all Muslim migration to the UK. 21.1% believe that Islam teaches its followers that the Quran must be read totally literally. And 26.5% of the British public believe that there are areas in Britain that operate under Sharia law where non-Muslims are not able to enter. And both of those claims are not true. Now, considering that many people in the UK learn attitudes about Islam from newspapers, these figures suggest that the media has played a role in these attitudes. It's certainly true that news values play a large part, though, in what newspaper editors decide what's worth reporting, and stories based around conflict and death and horror and negativity are much more likely to sell newspapers or get clicked on if you're looking at it online, and then that will generate advertising revenue for the newspapers. And we do need to bear in mind that they are in it to make money. They're businesses at the end of the day. So stories which describe terrorist attacks or wars or activities of people who hold extreme beliefs will be reported on. And that does pose a dilemma in terms of responsible media reporting. A minority of Muslims are receiving an awful lot of attention in the news, and they're the ones involved in violence and conflict. In a non-Muslim majority country like the UK, many readers will receive information about Islam based upon reading stories that repetitively focus on problematic cases. And this is likely to result in some readers overgeneralizing these negative representations of Muslims and Islam, which is more likely to result in Islamophobia, and that may result in some Muslims withdrawing from interaction with non-Muslims, and an increased sense of grievance on both sides. And this has the potential to engender more extremist belief, again on both sides, perpetuating a cycle of further negative stories about Muslims. And to be fair, this is something which some sections of the press are very concerned about. And this is my last example. This is from an article from the Yorkshire Post from 2015. And the author notes that allowing the term Muslim to become synonymous with extremist and potential terrorist is actually playing to the tune of Daesh, the so-called Islamic State. It's what they want. Division, hatred, and committing violence towards each other is central to their ideology. So the analysis that I've talked about here indicates that the British press have continued to associate Islam and related concepts with terror and extremism over time. while some sections of the press have taken a more nuanced perspective, I think there's still much work to be done to break these chains of association. So here are the references that I've mentioned in the talk, and I'll just say thank you for listening to the end. I'm going to stop there.